Welcome to the Just Life, where we expose problems of injustice, engage with people making a difference, and explore ways we can all live more justly in everyday life. I'm Benjamin Watson, and today I'm joined by Leah Rothstein. Excited about our special guest. She is the co-author of the book Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. And the book describes how local community groups can redress the wrongs of segregation. Leah has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government. She led research on reforming community corrections policy and practiced to be focused on rehabilitation, not punishment. She has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance. She's done a lot. Her policy work is informed by her years as a community organizer and labor organizer, working on issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and youth leadership. Leah, welcome to the Just Life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming and having this important conversation. Today, our theme, I always like to kind of have a theme, but it's going to be about moving from awareness to repair.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what you talk about, a lot of your work, is about awareness, making people aware about things that have happened in the past, things that are ongoing. But you kind of shift, which I'm grateful for, into this arena of repair. What do we do now? So this podcast is called The Just Life. It's about justice. It's about different forms of injustice and exposing those things. So I always like to start asking people like yourself, where did your compass come from when it comes to what is justice?
How long do we have?
We got plenty of tape.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a household where both of my parents were activists their whole lives, or from when they were, younger, before I was born. So I grew up in a household, a family of Jews who, in various ways, survived persecution in not that long ago generations. And I think that instilled in us, just sort of like in our DNA, the idea that we're not safe unless everybody's safe. And sort of we have to kind of look out for each other as a society, as community, as people, and that we have a role to play in ensuring that, people can live healthy, vibrant lives. If we want that for ourselves, we want that for other people too. And so my parents were activists as young people. I grew up in a household where I went to city council meetings and did my homework in the back. And I went to picket lines and protests with my parents. And I thought that was just normal. My dad worked for a union when I was younger. He went to an office. I thought like every other dad went to an office. And then I realized later that it was a little bit different what he did for work. And so I grew up knowing that that was an option of, you could devote your life to serving justice, to advancing community rights, and to social justice. And so I started doing that pretty early on in college, and have stuck with it in one way or another.
So what were the conversations like around the dinner table in the Rothstein household? I mean, the family vacations, were they ever to Disney World, or were they always doing something that was life-changing and important?
No, we had normal family life too. We went on a lot of camping trips. But I did go on some trips to different demonstrations. And I remember one Mother's Day action at a nuclear testing site in Nevada. My mom and I went for a Mother's Day excursion. So yeah, but that, we also had a normal family life.
So I want to press into the parents a little bit, because it's always interesting to hear how people like what are the on-ramps to these issues.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously being Jewish, I mean, there's a huge piece there. And one thing I heard you say was you felt like it was important for everybody to be protected, everybody to have rights, in order for us all to enjoy, rights and freedom, those sorts of things. You saw your parents. So all these issues you guys were picketing for and those sorts of things, they weren't particularly Jewish issues. Mm-hmm. They were things that impacted a bunch of other groups.
Yeah, that's right. My parents were really involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, the anti-Vietnam War movement, labor movement
Mm.
and women's movement, my mom. But civil rights sort of undergirded all of it. And I think it's because, there's a long history of Jews and African Americans fighting side by side. And my parents have some great stories about that. But it's interesting. I've talked to my dad about it, and it's not something that's necessarily spoken about a lot in our family. It's just kind of understood, like that's part of who we are, that we come from people who've experienced persecution, so we know what it's like, and so we can't sort of stand by and let that happen to others.
Yeah, it's kind of in your DNA. It's interesting because some people cower back from that, if it doesn't impact them. But I love the fact that you see how because you've experienced such in your own life and you're in the lineage of your family that you have to speak up. Because one of my questions I was going to ask you was, a lot of what you write about and speak about, especially in Just Action and even with your father, Richard Rothstein, in The Color of Law, fantastic book for anybody who hadn't read it. A lot of it has to do with Black communities, African American communities. And so I was going to ask you, like, why are you so outspoken about Black folks? Like you're not Black. Like, well, what's the link here? But you explained it perfectly. Do you ever feel, odd speaking so eloquently about a people group that you're not that you should, but there's kind of this underlying thing in America where it's like, you see Black folks speak out about Black issues, women speak about women issues, Jewish people, the list goes on and on. Do you ever feel like, I've got to come correct in this conversation?
Definitely. There's so many ways to get it wrong, right?
Yeah.
And I have felt uncomfortable or questioning if I'm the right person. I think, though, what's important is the message in The Color of Law and Just Action is that this is it's an issue as a country we have to address. It's all of our problem, racism and discrimination in housing and racial segregation. It affects all of us. And it was done in all of our names, as citizens of this country. And so we all have an obligation to do something about it. So I try to remember that when I get uncomfortable or anxious or worried about speaking about a group I'm not a part of. I think all of our movements would be more, would be stronger, would be strengthened if there's some more, a broader tent sort of who can speak about the issues, because not only is it all of our obligation to do something about it, but, there are more white people than Black people in this country. So if we really want to make a change, white people have to start speaking up too. We have to share the burden of making change on these issues.
Yeah. And it's one thing, when it comes to justice, you mentioned it. I mean, we're all under the banner of America.
Right.
And so the same way we celebrate the victories of America and with Independence Day and all those sorts of things, we also have to, not be guilty, but also take responsibility for the atrocities.
Exactly.
And find ways to remedy those things. So kind of moving towards the issue of residential segregation, because that's what, you've written a lot about and spoke about. A lot of people would say, when it comes to that issue, that people like living near each other. And so that's why we see segregation. I imagine you're not in that camp.
That is not the only reason or the main reason why our communities are segregated. That might have a role to play, that we somewhat self-sort into same race neighborhoods. But the real reason we are segregated as a country is because of government policy that explicitly and intentionally created racially segregated communities and then maintain that segregation. And not just separated people by race, but then separated resources. So when we talk about segregation, it's not just, like a benign separation of people. It's also a separation of resources, opportunity, investments. And so it's a kind of separation of people where some people are given more chances, more opportunity, more access to resources than others. And so it has really big consequences on people's lives and the health of our communities.
Does it still have those consequences? Because my father, you can attest to this too. When we speak to our parents' generation, it's like, they grew up in segregated communities. Then he lived through my parents both lived through, busing and integration, those sorts of things. But they both talk about there was some value. Well, there was some excellence in some of those neighborhoods. Now, I don't know if that was because that was the way it was set up and you had to, make do, but there was a certain amount of excellence that I think a lot of communities, Black communities, lost within segregation. And so you talk about this in Just Action, the fact that, while there were some exceptional situations, you talk about the Black lawyers, the Black congressmen and women who came from, HBCUs, and, my father talks about just the excellence in education, the teachers, all those sorts of things. You said that those were not necessarily anomalies, but they were adjustments that had to be made. But the overarching, atmosphere was segregation never gives equal opportunities, at least in this country.
Right. And that's the unfortunate, or worse than unfortunate. That's the sort of enraging truth, right? There have been pockets of same race neighborhoods of, well-resourced sort of middle-class Black neighborhoods that have produced lawyers and judges and, but those neighborhoods don't stay that way because of how our country operates. A segregated African-American neighborhood, even a middle upper class segregated African-American neighborhood, has more poverty than a similar sort of upper class white neighborhood, is closer to lower income neighborhoods, has more sort of the socioeconomic problems that come with being around poverty, has, less resources than a similarly income level white neighborhood. And they don't stay that way. They then become, more lower income people move in. It becomes an area of higher poverty, and with all the socioeconomic problems that come with that. And so in this country, we haven't been able to sustain a same race Black neighborhood that can sustain itself as a highly resourced neighborhood. And so we're not saying that, we argue obviously in Just Action, we need to challenge segregation around the country and all of our communities. That doesn't mean that everyone needs to live in a perfectly racially integrated neighborhood.
Because the math doesn't work.
The math doesn't work.
No offense to any Black people that live in Iowa, but I always pick Iowa as like the whitest state. I don't know why. It might be Iowa, like Montana,
Probably.
but you're not going to live in a diverse neighborhood if you live in those places, and it's not your fault.
Right. And not everyone wants to, and that's okay too. The point is that people should have choice, right? If they want to live in a highly resourced neighborhood, that's more likely to have more white people in it, and so they should be able to do that. And the problem with segregation in this country and the policies that have created and sustained it is that it has taken away choice from a lot of African-American families of where they can live. And we want to be able to open up all neighborhoods to all types of people.
Well, and, because you come from a Jewish background and this is important to you, I want to ask this question partly in ignorance, but in your research and as you're studying specifically policy that is disenfranchised Black Americans, and you see this integration, but the fact of the matter is, granted, I would say income levels have risen a bit, but the wage gap is widening, since the 70s, since integration. So the wage gap is widening, and we've had integration. It's not complete, clearly. But the Jewish community and two different communities, but many people look at the Jewish community and say, man, the Jewish community is able to resource themselves and all those sorts of things. Now, there are differences. There's a different cultural identity. There's different types of persecution and oppression. There's also different wealth. That's just different starting points for each community. But is there something, as you sit as someone of Jewish descent, is there something within that community where you can say, man, there is positivity when certain ethnic groups can work together? And the reason why I'm asking is, going back to before segregation, where, your grocer was somebody that you knew, that your parents knew. The teachers in your kids' school, they went to school with your parents. They spank your butt. If you got out of line, didn't tell your parents. There was a certain amount of honor there. Do you see that as a valid reason why, segregation, some positivity of segregation. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do think, and I try to differentiate in my language, because to me, segregation comes with this also deprivation of resources. Segregated neighborhoods, segregated Black neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods tend to be areas,
when it's forced.
Yeah, when
it's enforced by law.
Right, when it's enforced by law, it also comes with sort of a divestment of resources.
Mm-hmm.
But when a freely chosen sort of same race cultural enclave or ethnically similar neighborhood definitely has a lot of benefits, and people should be able to choose to live in those areas. It's when it comes with the sort of difference in resources and opportunity that it's a problem, and when it's forced.
Yeah, you think that's baked into the DNA of America?
So far, it has been. I don't think it's impossible to change, but that's a lot of people ask, why we're so focused on Black-white segregation, and our book is just about how to challenge segregation as it affects African Americans, even though other ethnic groups have suffered from similar policies or the same policies. And the reason is because the segregation of African Americans and the policies that have discriminated against Black people are unique and specific, and have had long consequences. Other ethnic groups, recent immigrants, say from Central America, or from Asia, come to the United States. They live in ethnically similar enclaves, where they all speak the same language and they know each other and they can help each other get jobs and housing. And then as the generations go on, their kids and grandkids move out into other neighborhoods. They assimilate and they can access, different neighborhoods in different areas. And that hasn't worked the same for African Americans in this country because of the structural ways that racism and discrimination has worked, that the sort of ongoing consequences are a lot more severe. And the policies that created it were more explicit and more explicitly unconstitutional. And so we believe have an obligation to remedy those unconstitutional actions, and then remedy their ongoing consequences to create more opportunity and to stop that cycle.
Yeah, I think the way you framed it was something like, you correct me, but you can't have race neutral, laws and expect to have, racial outcomes.
Right. Right. We've had these very race specific policies that created segregation, and now we pretend that we're beyond race. We're a post-racial society. So we can just adopt solutions for everybody and expect African Americans to benefit. Well, there's more white people than Black people in this country. So if you adopt a policy that offers everyone down payment assistance, more white people will access it. So it might be a good policy, but it's not a policy that will remedy those racially specific harms.
Yeah. I'm sure you've heard this before, because some people would say that, okay, that was unconstitutional, obviously. And we're going to get into some of those policies, because I want to hear explicitly some of the policies. But they would say those policies were unconstitutional. I agree with that. We shouldn't have ever had those race-based discriminatory policies were unconstitutional. But it's also unconstitutional for us to have race-specific remedies. Have you heard that before?
I've heard that, yes. A lot more lately.
What is your? I have a response. Well, what is your response?
I think, if we're trying to actually remedy race-specific crimes, you can't do that with race-neutral policies. It's not how it works. And so if we really if we're really concerned with remedying those race-specific crimes, we have to have race-specific solutions. Now, it's not that our solutions are discriminating. They're solutions to remedy a very specific harm. And if we connect those solutions to that specific harm, I think it is legally justifiable. And I think a lot of people can understand that, as opposed to sort of the rhetoric of this is reverse discrimination, we should all be treated equally. When people understand, this was a harm that certain people suffered in a way that other people didn't, well, then we have to address the way those certain people suffered, with a specific solution for those people.
And I think part of the hurdle is if people understand. And a lot of people don't understand. And this is not just this isn't a slight on any specific group. I mean, as Americans, we don't really understand, nor do we really care about what happened yesterday.
Yeah.
Like we're so forward thinking, like, you know, we don't even think about those things. But we don't understand because number one, certain things are taught and not taught to everybody. And then number two, a lot of us can't get over our own pride or, you know, having our feelings hurt or feeling like you're talking about us or talking about my grandparents, you know, when we're talking about things that are historical in nature and factual in nature. So let's talk about some of those things. What are some of the you know, racially discriminatory policies that have created the issues that we see now that you addressed in Just Action?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so many. My dad wrote a whole book about all of them. The Color of Law details all of the government policies that created segregation, enforced it, local, state, federal policies.
What are some that when you researched them, you were just like, I can't, or when you read the book, or you know, talking to your dad, like some of the ones where you're just like, I can't believe. Like for me, it was, you know, reading about like the GI Bill.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was reading about, you know, people who black soldiers who fought overseas and who gave their lives for this country. And, you know, black folks are present in every single war, fighting for the freedom of this country and its independence and those sorts of things. And then to come back and be treated the way they were, not being able to have, you know, certain, you know, benefits to help them build income through housing, those sorts of things. That in reading that book, those were some of the policies that I really I was like, man, I can't really fathom this. What were some of those things for you?
Yeah, the way the federal government subsidized the building of suburbs all over the country after World War II, when there weren't a lot of suburbs, most people lived in urban areas, and there was a housing shortage and a baby boom, you know, and war veterans came home and started families. And so the federal government used federal money to subsidize private developers to build suburbs outside of urban centers and subdivisions, build new homes for, you know, families in the post-war economy, and had a condition for those developers to receive this federal subsidy that they had to only sell their homes to whites and put what are called restrictive covenants in the deeds of their homes that said in the deed of the home, so it's part of the legal documentation of that property, that the home can only ever be sold to whites, sold or occupied. And this was written into the legal documentation. This was in the Federal Housing Administration's manual for how to decide which subdivisions could get this federal subsidy. They had to have these restrictive covenants and not be these subdivisions not even be built near where African Americans lived. So along with the GI Bill that helped those white families buy homes in those subdivisions and suburbs, you know, those homes were affordable to families at the time. So those families got into home ownership when it was affordable and built up wealth over the last, 60 years, right?
Yeah. It's a lot of compound
so much
interest
wealth.
growth.
Yeah. Those homes cost about $100,000 in today's money, which is a very affordable home price in a suburb. They now cost, you know, over $500,000, some places over $1 million, those same homes. So those families built up so much wealth just through getting into home ownership when they were offered the opportunity. African American families explicitly prohibited from doing the same. And so then we wonder, we see this wealth gap and the home ownership gap and the sort of compounding problems of living in poverty or not being able to build wealth for generations. And we think it's just how things are. And no, it was explicitly designed that way. And we're living with the consequences, and we will be forever until we take intentional steps to address that.
Yeah. The other one for me was the Interstate Highway System.
Oh yeah. And
that was, if you haven't read, it's almost like you got to be kidding me. Like this can't be life. Like this can't be real. That the highway system was uniquely designed, you know, to cut off communities. And that there weren't resources when you cut off the community with the highway system. Like I remember driving down I-95 in Miami and, you know, along the East Coast, and you think about those sorts of things, the way the design is. And but even now, when you look at the highway system, you're like, oh, it kind of makes sense. Why don't we teach these sorts of things?
I don't know, because it's difficult. I don't know. it conflicts with our narrative in this country of, personal responsibility and personal ability, that we succeed because we're personally exceptional, when it's not true. Some people succeed because they're given a lot of help.
And that goes for everybody.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
Right. But communities, so the highway system, these restrictive covenants, all of these policies were just compounded on top of each other, right? So there was redlining also in the 30s that before then, before the Depression, we didn't have the 30-year fixed mortgage system that we have today. So the Depression happened, people were out of work and they were at risk of losing their homes, their mortgages were going up. So the federal government helped create the 30-year fixed mortgage. Mm-hmm. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation went around the country deciding which neighborhoods should be able to access these 30-year fixed mortgages to help, families save their homes in the Depression. And they went to like every city in the country and made maps of those neighborhoods in those cities that said which neighborhoods were, a good candidates for investment with these mortgages and which neighborhoods were deemed too risky or hazardous is the word they used. The green areas, the areas that could access these mortgages, were where only whites lived. The red areas that were way too hazardous, quote unquote, according to these maps to be able to access these mortgages, were neighborhoods where blacks lived.
Yeah.
And so those neighborhoods were redlined. That meant that people in those neighborhoods couldn't get a mortgage to buy a home. So if they wanted to leave that neighborhood and buy a home, then they were in a neighborhood that had restrictive covenants that said those homes could only be owned.
So even if they had the funds, they had the wealth to move to another home, you couldn't.
Right. And then you take some of those redline neighborhoods still became thriving neighborhoods. You know, people were able to buy homes, start businesses, and then highways came through and knocked, bulldozed through those neighborhoods. Eminent domained their properties, shut down the businesses, kicked people out of their homes. So just you take all of those on top of each other, and how could people have built wealth and built thriving communities when it was just one hit after another of keeping these neighborhoods, divested and in poverty, basically.
Yeah, I think for some people, like you said, it's uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. People feel it pushes against that individual responsibility piece. And I think for me, it makes me angry. But also there's this balance that I've struggled with between knowing the history and what to do about it. But also, I think for some people, you throw your hands up. You're like, well, the government is clearly against us. It's always been against us and it always will be. So why should I even try? Like there's this whole mental thing, and you probably experience it in a different way. There's this whole mental gymnastics between wanting to know so that I can solve, right, but not wanting to know so it doesn't drag me down.
Right.
That's a conundrum we're in a lot of times.
Yeah. I think we need to know, right? We can't hope to change anything if we are not knowledgeable about how we got here.
Yeah.
So I think that that's important. And I get it. It's hard to know all of the details of our country's history. And, I've talked to a lot of people who read The Color of Law. It changed their minds about a lot of things. It maybe changed their career paths, but it wasn't an easy read. So many people I've talked to were like, I read that book, but I had to put it down. I kept having to put it down and take a break.
Yep.
It's hard to just fathom all of that and take it all in, especially those of us who didn't live through it,
Yeah.
But even people who did live through it have also told me, I didn't know that this is what was happening.
Yeah. Because like you said, you just knew it was just life.
I thought we were just having a hard time.
Yeah.
I didn't know that we were being denied these opportunities left and right.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to know because that's how we get somewhere else. And that's why we wrote Just Action, was to then take it from, well, what do we do with all of this information now that we know how we got here and we can see that we have an obligation to do something about it? What do we do? And so, my dad wrote The Color of Law. He hoped to retire after writing it. And it was, surprisingly popular and hit a nerve at a time in this country. And a lot of people read it. and which is great.
It was very timely.
Very timely.
I mean, all that was going on because it came out in 2020?
2017, actually.
2017, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have 2020 and, it's took off.
Yeah. And a lot of people were asking him, as he went around the country speaking about it, okay, now what do we do about it? And he eventually realized, okay, he had another book in him. He had to answer that question. And so
he kicked it off to you.
Yeah.
Got you involved.
He got me involved.
So is segregation still legal in America?
It's such an interesting question.
It is. It is.
It's more complicated than you think. So discrimination in housing is not legal. You cannot discriminate on the basis of race or other protected classes in this country because, the Fair Housing Act, 1968, made that illegal. Does that mean that segregation is illegal? Not exactly. There's a lot of ways that segregation is enforced today in ways that aren't explicitly discriminatory. I will say that segregation was established with policies that were unconstitutional in violation of the 14th Amendment, equal protection, these restrictive covenants, redlining, highway expansion, all of these ways that African Americans were explicitly harmed in ways whites weren't, or whites were given opportunities that African Americans were explicitly prohibited from accessing. Those were in violation of the Constitution. Those policies are no longer in place. We now have the Fair Housing Act. Says that kind of discrimination is illegal. First, it's not well enforced. So there still is housing discrimination that enforces segregation. That is illegal. It's not as explicit as those policies. So for example, real estate agents often engage in the practice of racial steering, where they where they will give different listings to their clients of different races or steer clients to same race neighborhoods. This is where you'd be comfortable living. Here are listings of houses in this neighborhood that you can access, and give a different client of a different race different listings for different neighborhoods. So in that way, they're sort of steering folks to same race neighborhoods and enforcing segregation. That's in violation of the Fair Housing Act, but it's not very well enforced. It still happens.
It's hard to find those things.
It's hard to find those things, but not impossible. There are what's called paired testing programs where they send volunteers or actors or people to pose as potential home buyers. So there was an expose done in 2019, not all that long ago, in Long Island, where they hired a bunch of actors, different races. They had the same qualifications on paper. They even sort of dressed similarly, and they went to different realtors around Long Island to say, pre-qualify me for a loan and let's see what houses I can access. And they were given different listings, the white and black testers. They were steered to different neighborhoods. Some were told, that there were only a couple houses in their income, in their qualifications. And while the white testers were given, far more.
Wow.
So this, and they wore cameras so they could document exactly how they were treated and talked to. So that kind of practice that enforces segregation, while illegal, still happens. And then there are other policies and practices that are perfectly legal, but they have the outcome of enforcing segregation, like zoning, for example. So zoning is how local governments decide how to use land, right? They say this area of the city is for industrial land use, this is for commercial, this is for residential. And then residentially zoned land is zoned to say what kind of residence can be built where.
Like single family,
apartment buildings, duplexes, et cetera. So most suburbs and most higher income, higher opportunity neighborhoods are zoned for only single family homes. That means you can only build one house per lot. There's usually a minimum lot size so that the lots are really large. So it ensures that only kind of big houses can be built there.
Yeah.
So those are expensive homes. Now that single family only zoning was born out of racialized zoning. Early in the 1900s, cities zoned their residentially zoned land by race. Explicitly. And they're written into their zoning code.
Okay.
This is a white residential zone. It's the black residential zone. that was found to be unconstitutional. And so many cities replaced their white zones with single family only zoning.
Okay.
So that ensured that those neighborhoods, the homes were large. You couldn't build more homes as demand increased because you can only build the number of lots that there are in that area.
Yeah.
So this is a main reason why the country as a whole is in an affordable housing crisis now, because we've capped the number of homes we can build with single family only zoning. So we've made those homes expensive, and they just keep getting more expensive as demand rises. And that has basically one of the main ways segregation has been enforced, keeping those areas mostly or all white by keeping the houses very expensive. And for all the reasons we've been talking about, white families are more likely to have the wealth needed to afford those homes. So zoning is a legal, way cities determine their land use. But the impact it has is enforcing and perpetuating segregation.
It's crazy that you mentioned the real estate agents, because there's been a long-standing, I'm sure you heard this, but there's a long-standing understanding, and I can only speak for Black families because I've been Black my whole life. But when Black families sell a home, you usually take down your pictures.
Yeah.
You take down the pictures, and everybody you're like, why would we do that? Well, it's because you don't want people to know who live there, number one, but also there's an idea that you won't get full price. Real estate agents won't steer certain buyers to your homes. I mean, I saw an article, I think before 2019, after 2019, only a couple of years ago, talking about the fact that an agent had, given two different prices to two different families. They might have been actors. The two different families, a white family and a Black family, for the same home, same qualifications, those sorts of things, but two different buying prices in order to filter some of them out. So these things they're not fallacious. Like, people aren't making these things up. They're documented. I think, again, the problem is that a lot of people just don't know about this stuff. And when we do hear about it, we assume that there's some flaw in the study.
Right. Yeah, that's a real issue. That's partly bias in the appraisal system, right? How homes are appraised to say what they can charge for them. Every home has to go through an appraisal. And there have been studies or anecdotes of people who've had an appraiser come, Black family or or biracial couple, and it appraises for a certain price and they think it sounds low. So they, quote unquote, whitewash their home and get white friends to stand in as owners. And then it appraises for more. That's a real problem, right? And this is, again, one of those things that compounds the issues we're talking about. If your home can't appraise for what it's actually worth, you can build up less wealth through selling your home. You can't refinance it for what it's worth. But just to move on to the hope section of this,
we're going to get there. Yeah. We're going to get there for sure. But before we move there, how should people respond if they feel like they've been benefiting from an unjust system? Because I think that as we move to the hope section, there's quite a lot of it. But I think for some people, they would hear that and be like, and start thinking back at their life and say, oh, wow, is that why I got the home and this other person didn't? Is this how my family ended up having this amount of wealth over time because they were chosen to do this and other people weren't? And that can be heavy too. So how should people respond when they realize that they benefited from an unjust system?
That's a great question. There's a lot of ways to respond. I've talked to people who, have inherited homes, and then, white people who've inherited homes from their parents or grandparents, and then learned about the history of segregation and racial discrimination in housing. And so when they sold the home, donated a part of the proceeds to an organization working to address these issues. Or people who learn about how their community started to look, became to look the way it does as a segregated, affluent white community. And so started to organize to allow more housing to be built, more multifamily housing, more affordable housing. I think that there's a lot of ways to get involved in solutions. And once we learn sort of how we have benefited from the system, and I think it's not only those who've benefited, but we all have an obligation to do something about this, right? Because our country, the way our communities are structured and the way our residential landscape looks is based on unconstitutional policies, unfair treatment of African Americans. And so we as a country have an obligation to remedy that. So once we start learning about this, no matter if we've benefited a lot or not, because Some people might not think they've benefited much. Some people might. That we all have an obligation to do something and a role to play in creating solutions. And there's a lot of solutions that we can be involved with, from local programs and policies and advocacy to donations or financial support of organizations addressing these, to even simply, or sort of simply, like the testing program I talked about. You could volunteer to be a tester to try to root out where housing discrimination is happening. And
everybody wants to act.
Yeah, right.
Right. Might be your acting debut.
Exactly.
You can kill two birds with one stone. You can act and you can act for justice.
Right,
so,
right. And it's a pretty simple way individually to just plug into something that directly affects discrimination in your own community.
Have you ever personally, or your family personally, wrestled with any of this? Like, and had to find ways to respond? I mean, in your research, have you, gone like, oh, wow, this impacted us? And I mean, I know you do a lot, but has that been a personal?
Yeah. I mean, I have definitely benefited from my family being able to build wealth through home ownership, from my grandparents to my parents to helping me get into a house. So I've thought about how to pay that forward and what to do with that privilege that I have and the sort of benefit I have from those past policies that allowed them to do that. And I'm thinking about how to use my wealth, I guess, from my home ownership once I'm gone, how to leave my home in a way that can help address these issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned the hope piece, and there's a lot of hope. But one thing you do talk about that I want to address is you talk about, action over just awareness. And, you made an insightful statement. I was looking through Just Action. And I want to ask you about this. You were talking about the outcomes from bias training. And one thing that, implicit bias is kind of a word that I guess it got really popular like 5 years ago, 6 years ago. It's always been there, but just with everything that the country had been going through, the idea of implicit bias kind of came up. And implicit bias is just, how we assume about people, how we see people without even really knowing them or anything about them. And we all have certain implicit biases based on our personal experiences and based on what we read about in the media. But you talk about this. You say that more important than trying to eliminate implicit bias is taking action that redresses segregation. And if that action is successful, implicit bias will wither naturally. How so?
Yeah, another complex concept, I think, to wrap our brains around, because it's true. We've gotten a lot of messages, especially 2020 around then, about, addressing your implicit bias. That's the way through to sort of address racism in this country. And it's true. We have to address our implicit biases. If we're going to expect people to engage in campaigns, say locally on policy issues that are intending to address segregation, they're going to need to address their implicit bias in order to get there, right?
Yeah.
To understand that we're all equal, that we're all deserving of the same chances. But that's not enough. Just sort of looking inward and examining our own sort of thought processes and assumptions isn't going to change any structures in our society. So whether or not we are successful at addressing our implicit biases, we need to be engaging in these actions to change the structures of our communities. And once those change, implicit biases will automatically change, because our implicit biases are born from what we see.
Wow.
So if you think about, the redlining example, where Black communities were redlined, couldn't get mortgages, they couldn't, the people in those communities couldn't leave to live in other communities. So those communities became overcrowded. The local governments didn't pick up trash as often as they did in other neighborhoods. So the communities started to look like slums, because of the structures that existed, because people had to double, triple up in homes. And they spent a lot of time on their front porches because there were, a lot of people in the home. Yeah. The trash wasn't getting picked up. So that created a bias in our society that's how Black people live. Now, if we change the structures and the policies, cleaned up, picked up trash in those neighborhoods, fixed up the homes, allowed people at the time to get mortgages and to build more homes and to fix up the neighborhoods and start their own businesses. If those kinds of structures existed, we would see something different and people's biases would change.
Yeah.
So we gave an
That
example.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That makes a whole lot of sense.
We gave an example in the book about doctors, right? For a long time, when someone heard, the doctor will see you now, assumed it was going to be a man, right? Because most doctors were men. And then, it started changing. More women started going to med school. Now, I don't know the numbers, but I think there's at least equal numbers of women, if not more women doctors than men, especially in like family practice, right? So now people don't necessarily have the same assumption when they say the doctor will see you now because they've seen something different on TV, in their own doctor's offices. Younger people probably don't have that same bias.
That's
So
true.
whether or not they were doing that internal work about their expectations of who a doctor is, their bias changed because of what they saw around them. So it's sort of it's a both and. We should be thinking about our internal biases and working on those, but that isn't enough to change what we think needs to be changed. We can instead, work on those changes, and those biases will eventually change as a result.
Yeah, the both and piece is the difficult piece.
Yeah.
And I think you're exactly right. I wonder, even with that example you gave with the doctors, was there an explicit, were there explicit actions that were taken by the powers that be to incorporate more female doctors? Or did the biases change and then they enacted and then they brought in more female doctors? You see what I'm saying? Because the both and tension is difficult. I almost feel like my frustration, I think sometimes, is that, we just got to focus on one side of it. I feel like people aren't capable of doing the both and. It's like some people are just capable of just worrying about the biases and the heart, and some people are just more capable about doing the actions.
Right.
But the both and, I think, is where we do want to land, but it's taking forever.
It is taking forever, and that's why in the book we emphasized, okay, then focus on the action.
Yeah,
that's what's going to actually make a difference.
Let's just do it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the actions. You list a bunch of things, and a lot of your focus is about local policies. So when you're looking at local policies, what are the local policies that are in most need of reform? You talked about zoning laws, but what about tax codes? You talk about property assessments, those sorts of things. I'm sure any and all of them, but if you could pick some, like what are the local processes that need some change?
Oh, all of them. So we described dozens of local policies that we could focus on that could begin to chip away at segregation or remedy its consequences. We are careful not to pick a favorite, like picking a favorite child, because they're all important.
Even though we have them.
Maybe. They're all important, and we're going to need them all eventually. And so what we say is that the way any community starts to address these issues, it sort of doesn't matter which they start with, just that they get started on addressing the policies that perpetuate segregation. Now, that said, there are some that are important to change first, like zoning. We can't actually open up suburban neighborhoods to more diverse residents. We can't address now, the massive affordable housing crisis that the whole country is facing if we don't change our zoning laws. So we have to address zoning issues to allow a broader range of housing sizes and types in all neighborhoods, to provide a broader range of affordability options in all neighborhoods. That in and of itself won't, fix segregation by itself.
Yeah.
Because, for the reasons we have been talking about. So you take an expensive suburban neighborhood that has been single family only zoned for a long time. You now allow duplexes and triplexes to be built there.
Yeah.
That's great. Say new duplexes are built. It's still probable that white homebuyers will outbid African Americans for those homes. So it doesn't necessarily change the racial segregation of that community without some other intentional steps.
So what you're saying is, if you have a suburban neighborhood, it's single family zone, it's got, nice size houses, 3-4 bedrooms, whatever, and you change the zoning laws to allow some apartments or duplexes to come in there, the number one thing people are going to say is, it's going to drive down my property value because now I've got apartments and I've got duplexes. Outside of, those people that are moving in there, I'm not even talking about how they feel about the people that are moving in there, but what they're going to say is, just the presence of the apartments and the duplexes next to my single family home is going to drive down my property value. Will it?
No, the evidence hasn't shown that that's the case. In fact, as there's more supply of housing, there's more demand. Right now we are not, lacking in demand for housing in any neighborhood. And so as you build more people will move in to that neighborhood, and it becomes, an even more thriving neighborhood. It doesn't bring down property values. And I would argue that a lot of people who use that argument, they might not be doing this consciously, but it's often historically been an argument about the people that they expect to move into the neighborhood.
Oh, of course.
And so it's not just about, the building being multifamily that's going to bring down the property values. But there have been many studies that have studied putting affordable housing developments, for example, low-income housing developments in single-family only neighborhoods, and the property values have not fallen. In some cases, they've risen. So it doesn't prove to be true. And I would argue too, in speaking to your question earlier about what do we do if we recognize we've benefited from this system. Part of that is, I think, challenging this idea that we have a right to our property values always rising, that it's something we're entitled to. I buy this home, it's always going to increase in value. And the only way for it to always increase in value is for my neighborhood never to change, for it to remain looking the way it did when I bought this home. This is an idea that I think started to be adopted in the 70s, when there wasn't a lot of growth. There was a lot of obstacles to building more housing, and people started relying on their increased property value for their retirement savings, for example, because we don't have a good safety net in this country. And so this sort of entitlement to always increasing property values leads people to then oppose any changes in their neighborhood because they need this increase in property value, or they think it's their right. And not only does it not decrease property values to build more housing in a community, but I would argue that we have to kind of let go of that entitlement, because our communities thrive when they change and grow related to, how people and how society changes and grows. And so to do that, we need to allow more people to be able to live in our communities. And I'll give an example. I wrote a column. We have a Substack column also called Just Action. And one of the first ones I wrote, I think around when the book came out, was about a community in California near where I live in Silicon Valley. I don't live in Silicon Valley, but the community was in Silicon Valley. Very expensive, wealthy community. Median home prices are like $2 million there. And people there, started recognizing the privilege and wealth that they have and the policies that help to create that situation in their community. And they developed a training. They called it Color of Law Menlo Park Edition. Okay. This was Menlo Park. And so they went around the community doing this training, this workshop to show all of the government policies that made Menlo Park look the way it does, made it as expensive as it is, and the demographics look the way it does. So people started to understand that it was not an accident that their homes are so expensive and that their community, the racial makeup is what it is. And they started thinking, like, how can we create an organization to advance more inclusive housing in this community? So they started an organization, started recruiting members, and they were talking to people around the neighborhood, and there were, their favorite cafe was reducing its hours because they couldn't get any workers to work there because they couldn't afford to live nearby. The school district in their area, a third of the teachers every year left because they had to commute hours because there was no affordable housing anywhere near there. So this was impacting them personally. The exclusivity of their neighborhood, had repercussions on the people who live there. So the school district had a piece of vacant land, proposed to build teacher housing, 90 units of housing affordable to teachers and other school staff. And some members of that neighborhood didn't like it. Yeah. And so they put a measure on the ballot that would have stopped that development and made any rezoning in the future have to go before the voters. So any lot that wanted to change its zoning to allow denser housing had to be voted on by all of the voters in the city. So this organization that had started by talking about the policies that created the segregation of this area started a campaign to defeat this ballot measure. And they went door to door and they talked to their neighbors, talked to everybody, you know, and like even people that they would stand in front of the house and think this isn't going to work. These people aren't going to agree with me. And they would talk to them and realize, oh no, they did understand how, you know, because of how expensive their housing is in that community, it was having real impacts on their lives, on their kids' lives. And so they defeated the measure. And so that's just an example of, you know, what we can do when we just start talking about these issues and understand how they're all related, and how even if I might not live in that affordable housing development down the street, it impacts me to not have it. You know, it impacts my neighborhood to not have a broader range of accessibility for different types of people. We shoot ourselves in the foot, basically.
Ignorance is so dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. I mean, just the mere fact that people can learn about something and then understand how it does impact them, but also understand that there needs to be remedies. I mean, nobody wants to see anybody harmed. If I'm harmed, I want it to be fixed, right? And ignorance keeps you in the dark on these things, that it allows this type of discrimination to persist. So that's an amazing example. So all right, so I'm gonna press the pause button.
Okay.
We were talking about zoning laws. Now let's go to tax codes, property assessments, whatever else, local policies.
Yeah. Zoning law is important. Property tax assessments, another important piece that you don't hear a lot about, although I'm starting to hear more about it these days. But okay, we've talked about property appraisals.
Which is when you sell
That's when you sell or
home.
refinance your home, and an appraiser tells you what they think it's worth. There's bias in that, where homes owned by African Americans are underappraised. So said that the value is lower than it actually is. And that's detrimental when you're trying to sell your home or refinance it. Now, property assessments are different. That's for property taxes. Local county tax assessors create assessment systems to try to determine how much every home in their county is worth, so that they can apply their tax rate, and that is how much your property taxes are. So everybody pays the same tax rate. It's a certain percentage applied to the assessed value of your home. So if you have a high assessed value, you pay more property taxes. That's how property tax system works. Now, the assessed value is supposed to be as close to the market rate value of your home as possible. But there's no way to know the true market value of a home unless it's sold.
Unless it's sold,
So the property assessor of the county has to determine what they think the assessed values are. Now, there's problems with that system. It's pretty opaque. We don't really know how they do it. But it's not done very accurately and not done very frequently, the reassessments. So say a county assessor will do an assessment countywide and give an assessed value to all of the properties in the county. And we researched this for Just Action, many county assessors that we researched in big counties, around the country hadn't done a proper reassessment for 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
Wow.
So in that time, without a proper reassessment, they just do annual adjustments.
They're just guessing.
They're kind of just guessing. I mean, they're guessing based on a 20-year-old assessment. And then they say, this year, we think all of the properties in this jurisdiction went up in value by 1% because the market was hot. Now this year, we think they all go down by 0.5%. So they adjust them all at the same rate every year when a proper reassessment is not done. That's how the assessed values change. And in that time, that's not how the true values of those homes work. They don't all go up or down at the same rate.
Yeah.
In predominantly white neighborhoods, they increase in value. Homes increase in value a lot quicker than those adjustments. And in homes in neighborhoods of color and Black neighborhoods, the homes stay the same value or sometimes decrease in value.
And that's because of
market conditions, because of discrimination, because of appraisals, because of racial steering.
A host of issues.
Yeah, because of all of the reasons that that white neighborhoods are richer and Black neighborhoods are not. And so in that time, those white homes the homes owned by white families in white areas of the county, their true value is a lot higher than their assessed value, right? Because the assessed adjustment went up 1%, but their true market value went up 15%.
So they're paying
less than they should. And homes in Black communities, their homes have stayed the same value or gone down, while their assessed value has been adjusted up the same 1%. So they're paying more than they should. Does that make sense?
It makes, yeah. So in those in the neighborhoods where the assessed value is higher than the actual market value of the home, they're paying in taxes a higher percentage of their income.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
And it's vice versa in the other neighborhoods.
Yep. And across the country, Black homeowners are overpaying in property taxes to the tune of 10 to 13% more than white homeowners when you hold the values of their homes constant. So when you're paying too much in property taxes, even if you own a home, you can't build up the same amount of wealth because more of your money's going out to property taxes, right?
So is that an issue of I'm playing devil's advocate again. But this is a real question. Is that an issue of, rich versus poor, or is that more economic?
Yeah.
At this point, instead of being strictly racial?
It's that's a good question.
An advantage of the wealthy?
Yeah.
Or more wealthy?
It's more economic. I think that higher income or higher valued homes are more likely to be underassessed, and lower value homes are more likely to be overassessed. Now, lower value homes are more likely to be in neighborhoods where Black and brown people live, and higher value homes are more likely to be in white neighborhoods. So they track.
You can't detangle
really
the two.
them.
You can't.
Yeah.
In our country, you can't. Unfortunately, you can't decouple race and economics.
Right.
From a historical perspective or a present perspective.
Right. Exactly.
Unfortunately.
But this is a local issue.
Yeah.
County tax assessors, we can advocate that they take a look at their assessment system and try to find where this disparity exists and, fix it. And there are cities that are doing that are starting, or counties that are starting to look at how to take that racial disparity out of the tax assessment system.
So many of the remedies you talk about are citizen-led. They're local remedies that have impact across the country. But so many of the issues that you talk about in the color of law are federal.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile the two? Does the federal government have no role in redressing segregation, or is it a minimized role, or are you just not talking about that right now because you think there's more power locally? Is it all those things?
All of those things.
Yeah.
So it's true. The federal government had the largest role to play in creating segregation. But once it's created, to a large extent, local policies sustain that segregation. So the federal government set it up, and then local policies keep it going. So zoning policies, tax codes, tax assessments, funding for affordable housing, a whole tenant protections, all sorts of local policies that either sustain or can challenge segregation. So there's a lot that we can do locally that can have a real impact on segregation because it's those local policies that are maintaining it, right? Even though the federal government helps set it up. That doesn't mean the federal government is off the hook. We could certainly use some leadership on the federal level to enforce these changes locally, for example. There was the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which was part of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It said that jurisdictions not only had to, couldn't discriminate in housing, but had to affirmatively further the purposes of the act. So they had to affirmatively take actions to challenge segregation and housing discrimination. This was written into the law in 1968. It wasn't until Obama's administration that was defined how jurisdictions had to do that.
Say it one more time. So it was written in 1968, but it was just ambiguous.
It was ambiguous. There wasn't enforcement. Jurisdictions didn't know what it meant to affirmatively further fair housing. Yeah. So the Obama administration wrote a rule that told them how to do that. They had to create plans. They had to do a whole analysis of the impediments of fair housing in their whole jurisdiction by involving, local governments, transportation agencies, school districts, all all of the sort of agencies and systems that affect segregation and are impacted by it, and create a plan to challenge all of those obstacles to desegregation. And then they were sort of held to account for implementing that plan. Mm-hmm. So that was great when it was in effect. Trump rescinded it in his first term. Biden tried to put it back and never really adopted it. It's now obviously not happening. Trump too took it out. So there's no now requirement federally for the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act or rule. That is an example of the way the federal government can sort of enforce local action around segregation. But
it just takes too long, and it's too dependent on who's in office, and it's not sustainable.
Exactly. And we don't, we're now speaking in 2025. We don't have any hope right now of the federal government taking leadership on challenging segregation. The only way we can get to that point where we have a national leadership on this is starting locally by electing, local elected officials that can enact these solutions locally, and building a movement that then can start to elect national representation that cares about challenging segregation. So we focus on local action, not only because it can have a real impact on our own communities, on, challenging segregation in our own communities, but because that's how we have to start building up the movement we need to make federal change.
Yeah.
If we just, talked about the federal policy change we need right now, I think we'd be, speaking into a void. It's not realistic.
But it sounds good.
It sounds good.
It sounds great. And, I feel like some people would rather talk about, the federal government and the big grandiose policy than actually the granular change-making, local policies.
Oh, that's very true, because the granular local policies feel small. They feel very difficult. It involves me talking to my neighbors and having maybe uncomfortable conversations, maybe showing up to city council meetings, or, putting myself out there on a local level with my own neighborhoods and my own community that can be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it can feel, frustrating and maybe small. We have this idea in this country, in this society, that everything needs to be big and quick. Like, it doesn't matter, change doesn't count unless it's immediate. We want to see immediate results. We want to see, huge impact. But that's not how housing policy works. Even all of the things that we've been talking about that have created segregation, those were, small incremental steps, each one of them. And together they added up to the system we have today. So we have to sort of understand that, and understand that to undo it, we need small incremental steps to challenge segregation. If we're sort of waiting to enact the big silver bullet that's going to fix everything on the federal level, we're going to be waiting around for a long time, and our communities will remain segregated, while we're waiting for that to happen. So why not start with small changes that can have an impact on people's lives today?
Yeah. So we've talked about the tax codes. We've talked about the property assessments. Talked about the zoning laws. There are several others in the book that you write about. But have you been able to create some sort of formula? Because we like stuff fast and quick in America, but we also like to know where we're going.
Yeah.
So we like to understand that, okay, if we get moving, on some of these projects, how long is it going to take to close a wealth gap? How long is it going to take to have these neighborhoods that have, mixed housing and single family and apartments and duplex? Like, how long is it going to take to change some of this stuff and redressing segregation? What kind of prediction can you give us in that, or are we just on a hamster wheel?
I don't think we're on a hamster wheel. But if I gave a prediction yesterday, today it would be different, especially given politics right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I say that because, the GAO came out with a report, Government Accountability came out with a report a little while ago talking about school segregation. And, while public schools are less segregated than they were, in the 60s and 50s and before, they're increasing over the last 10 years with segregation as far as ethnicity goes. And they're comparable in some ways to the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And, even though we are, years, 50, 60 years past civil rights movement, fair housing, all those sorts of things, integration starting when our parents were bused to different schools, we're way past that. But school segregation looks alike. And I think, and you correct me, I think it's because of residential segregation looking.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's exactly right. So my dad used to be an education policy guy. He wrote about school segregation and achievement gap stuff. And, he was studying the Black-white achievement gap for students in public schools. And there, at the time, this was the time of No Child Left Behind. And there was a lot of attention put on teacher quality, that's why students were achieving differently. And he did a lot of research and found that no, it was actually the segregation of the schools that made the achievement of the kids different, because schools in segregated lower income neighborhoods, just were dealing with a lot more challenges and less resources than schools in segregated high resource white neighborhoods. And so the students achieved differently, not because the kids were, had different intelligence, but they were dealing with different challenges and different levels of resources at their disposal. And so he started looking to why are schools so segregated? And that's how he came to start writing about residential segregation, actually, is he was like, wait, schools are segregated because neighborhoods are segregated. Yeah. And why are neighborhoods so segregated? And then he dug into residential segregation, and that's how The Color of Law was born. Wow. But it was also because there was a Supreme Court case for challenging a pretty trivial school desegregation effort in Louisville and Seattle. It was they were a joint case that, wasn't a comprehensive desegregation busing effort, but a trivial way of trying to address school segregation in those cities. And the Supreme Court said, no, that this was unconstitutional to try to desegregate schools. And Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion and said that because the government didn't create segregation, it didn't have to do anything to address it in the schools or in the communities. And my dad read that, because he was studying school policy, and was like, is that true? Yeah. And he remembered a story from Louisville of a family, a Black family that wanted to buy a home in, I'm going to forget the year, the 40s maybe, wanted to buy a home in a white community and couldn't buy it because they were Black. So got a white friend, to buy the home for him and then sell it to him. Wow. A straw buyer is what it was called. And so he did. And when the Black family tried to move into this home in Louisville, a mob came out and firebombed the home. And the police stood by and let the mob do this, and then arrested the Black homebuyer and the white homebuyer. And the white man who bought the home as a straw buyer for this family was tried and convicted of sedition for helping this family get a home. And so my dad knew that story from Louisville, and then was reading the Supreme Court opinion about how the government in Louisville didn't do anything to create segregation. I was like, wait a second, these two things don't fit. This doesn't make sense. And so that's what led him to start researching all of the ways that local, state, federal government created segregation.
And that type of violence in Louisville was fairly common. If I remember reading some of your dad's writings, some of y'all's writings, like this happened all over the country. Right. Whenever segregation happened. So
right. And it wasn't just, I want to be clear, not just the mob that did it, but it was the mob that created the violence, but the police stood aside and let them do it. Yeah. Then district attorney charged the white.
It's all levels of it's state sanctioned violence.
Exactly.
All right. So as we get ready to close, I want you to speak directly to a couple of people. One of them is sitting in front of you, but I'm gonna let you talk to me last. The first one is the person, and we kind of talked about it earlier, but the person sitting here that's saying, I didn't create this problem. Why should I fix it?
Yeah. So I like to quote or paraphrase Isabel Wilkerson here, who wrote Caste and The Warmth of Other Suns, brilliant books. And she writes in Caste that it's like if you buy a house and move into a house that has a cracked foundation, You don't move in and say, well, I didn't crack the foundation. I'm not going to fix it. I'm just going to live here as if it didn't happen. No, if you want to live in a house that's going to be safe and secure and stable, you have to fix what came before you, right? Even if you didn't cause the damage. And so I think that's a helpful metaphor to think about in terms of these issues. We didn't have to have been here to cause the damage, but we're here living with the consequences. And so we have an obligation if we want to see, not only if we want a country that repairs its harms, which I believe we should, and we have a lot of work to do on that these days, but also if we want to live in a country where everybody has equal access to long, healthy lives, then we have to address these issues, even if we didn't cause them. We can't just wash our hands of them and expect to see the kind of country that we think we deserve and are, should have without having to do something to get there. That's always how America's been, right? Yeah. We can't just sit here and let it happen and assume that it's going to get better. We have to be involved in those solutions.
And we're all impacted. Whether we think we are or not, whether we think we're living in our little enclave, we're all impacted in some respect.
Yeah, and I'll say, there's a lot of ways of looking at that. There's economists who've studied how segregation has impacted our country's GDP, and that our GDP is suppressed because of racial segregation. That the country as a whole is less productive because people can't move freely to where they can get the best job and be the most productive. So that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Another way is, from Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us. She describes how when community pools were forced to be racially integrated, so it used to be that communities had pools, some where whites could swim and some where blacks could swim. And when in the 60s, when they had to integrate their pools, a lot of communities just shut their pools down instead of integrating them. So who wins in that situation? Nobody.
Everybody suffers.
Right. And so we all suffer when we're trying to maintain, keep this rigid separation. It hurts all of us. So there's a lot of different ways to think about it. But I think, the overarching theme is that it's better for everybody to address these issues. Whether or not we were here when they were created, we're living with the consequences now. And if we want to see something different, it's up to us to change it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And the second person is somebody like myself, who you're sitting across from the last hour, 45 minutes or so. And thank you again for that. Somebody like myself, I'm a husband, almost 20 years, father. I'm employed. I am a resident. I live outside of a city center, not too far from the city center, rural/suburban, I guess you would call it. What should I do from where I sit? Like, if you were talking to me, and I want you to talk to me and challenge me on this issue, on this form of justice, this form of economic housing justice, what would you tell me to do as first, second, and third steps?
Oh, so many things. I mean, having these
and don't hold back. Don't hold back because we're sitting across from each other. Okay. No, seriously. I want you to tell me exactly what you think I should do.
I mean, I think, so I'll start sort of from the personal to bigger, but having these conversations with your kids, with your family, with people who don't look like you, engaging in these kinds of conversation and this dialogue about, what our community looks like, what we hope to see. I don't know who lives around you, but I imagine there's a lot of different kinds of people. And so having conversations and getting to know each other to begin to start to open up dialogue and understanding so that we can then start to think about, how our community can serve everyone. Because I think one of the reasons we're stuck in these patterns is because we're so segregated from each other that we don't understand each other very well. I mean, even more so now, the polarity, the political polarization in this country is such that we can't understand each other as human beings. And if we don't understand each other, we can't then, understand why we should try to change anything to something that might benefit someone else. We have to break down those walls. So having conversations, engaging in dialogue, investing in time and resources in organizations that is fostering those kinds of conversations. I'm working on a blog piece now about a group in Marin County in California, north of San Francisco, wealthy county, predominantly white, has one little section of the county that is predominantly African-American. That's where the shipyard workers worked in World War II. And a church there has started a monthly dialogue called Come to the Table, where they invite 25 residents of, it's called Marin City, this little pocket, and 25 residents from the rest of the county to sit and have dinner together and just talk about issues that are important to this African-American neighborhood.
Okay. And
they're starting to build community that way and understanding and inspiring people to action. So I would say starting to have those conversations and engaging in what's happening locally. It's also sort of easy for us to have these high, conversations that are up here when really, like we've talked about earlier, what matters is the action that is connected to a place, which is right here in your own community, in your city. What are the policies being debated around housing right now, around zoning, around, building affordable housing or multifamily housing, or what kind of resources are available to moderate income families to be able to access homes. How can you engage in those policy debates or advocacy or elect the elected officials that care about those issues? So being engaged in sort of your local politics. And then there's also a lot of ways for you personally, probably, that you can contribute to efforts that are doing this, not only locally, but around the country. I can think of some examples of people who do have access to resources and wealth, who then use that to help, pay for down payments for families who have the income to qualify for a mortgage, but not the wealth to afford a down payment because of all the policies we've been talking about that didn't allow their family to build up intergenerational wealth. So there's organizations that do that raise money to then provide down payment assistance to Black and Brown families to help them start that wealth building journey, to kind of take the place of intergenerational wealth. So I would say those are the things that come to mind.
Quite a few things, but it gives us a blueprint. Thank you for that. What's at stake? In 2020, we saw a lot of people talk about Black Lives Matter. We saw millions of people march. For those 2 years afterwards, you saw companies, banks, other institutions talk about trying to make change. Now we're years later. A lot of that change hasn't happened. You write a lot in your book about, there's one paragraph where you guys talk about the fact that it's not easy, but it's much easier to garner millions of people that want to support and millions of corporations that say they're going to do X, Y, and Z. But there's always only a few that are actually converted into, activists and actual change makers. What's at stake right now in this moment on this issue if we don't recruit more change makers to address this?
I mean, I think we're living what's at stake right now with the what's happening on the federal level. A lot of the support for local efforts to redress segregation or address housing need are being, gutted by the federal government, whether it's funding or fair housing laws. If we don't start to take this on locally and build up the support locally for these kinds of efforts, for laws and policies that support non-discrimination in housing, for example, or support funding for affordable housing, we're going to just see more of what we're seeing right now, which is a backward slide on all of these issues. And so I would say we're living in the backlash of 2020 and all of the sort of awakening and vocalization about racial justice issues. And if you think of our country as sort of a pendulum of politics, we're swinging back right now, but we're going to swing back forward, I believe, as people start to see that all of these retractions and steps backward aren't good for us as a country. And so we have to be ready to harness that energy when we swing back the other way and build up the support in our communities to start to make changes locally and to be able to regain our footing when the time is right.
Yeah. Well, this podcast is called The Just Life.
Mm-hmm.
And we ask everybody what the just life means to them. So for Leah Rothstein, the just life means.
The just life means living in communities where everybody sort of has, living in thriving communities where everybody has equal opportunity and, equal opportunity to live those thriving, long, happy lives, whatever that means for them. And the just part of that is that we're all involved in making that happen, that we don't leave that to someone else to create the country, the sort of vision we want to see, that we're all involved and invested in how our community serves all of us. And we're sort of looking beyond our own bubble of our personal self-interest and seeing how everybody's well-being affects my well-being. And we see our interconnectedness and take action resulting from that.
Well, Leah, thank you for joining The Just Life. Thank you for your time. Most importantly, thank you for your dedication. Because what's crazy is like when you write a book and this, you've been speaking about this, talking about this, writing about this for a long time. You went to school for this. You've been doing this since you were coming out of the womb. That's what it sounds like from your family. But at certain times in people's lives, all of a sudden people are aware of what you've done, but you've been doing the work for a very, very long time. And so thank you, not just for writing the book and for speaking publicly now about it, but thank you for the organizing and the writing and the economic policy and how all the sorts of things that you've been doing that we talked about in the very beginning. Thank you for doing those things over the course of your life, and for deciding to just act. So give your father our regards.
I will.
That's Leah Rothstein, and this was The Just Life.